I loved the quiet. Tower 9 stood tall among endless trees, its wooden frame creaking with each breeze. I had volunteered for the fire watch post to escape. From what? I wasn't sure. Maybe the noise of the world, maybe myself. For weeks it was just me and the forest. The radio's occasional static brought updates and check-ins from distant towers. But today felt different. The air hung still, too still, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I had taken the job after everything fell apart. A breakup that left me hollow, a career that had lost its meaning, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The Firewatch Tower was supposed to be my fresh start. 4 weeks of solitude, just me and the wilderness. No deadlines, no conversations filled with unspoken resentments, just silence and the vast untamed beauty of the forest. The tower itself was old, older than the others still in operation. Tower 9 had been built decades ago, and it showed. The wooden planks creaked with every shift of the wind, and the stairs groaned under my weight each time I climbed. The paint had long since peeled away, exposing raw wood to the elements. A metal plaque near the entrance still bore the name of the original ranger stationed here, though the letters were too worn to read. Inside, the living quarters were sparse. A cot pushed against one wall, a small wood stove in the corner, a desk covered in old maps and a logbook. The radio was ancient but functional, mounted to a shelf near the window. A few cabinets held enough food to last the season, mostly canned goods and dried staples. There was a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and an emergency flare. Practical necessities, nothing more. The view, though, that was something else entirely. From the wraparound balcony, I could see the endless expanse of the forest stretching toward the horizon. Rolling hills covered in evergreens, a lake shimmering in the distance, and somewhere far beyond, the jagged peaks of the mountains. In the evenings, the sunsets painted the sky in hues of orange and violet, bleeding into the treetops below. On clear nights, the stars looked close enough to touch. I settled into a routine quickly. Mornings started with a pot of coffee brewed on the stove, the scent filling the cabin as I flipped through the logbook, updating reports on fire risks and weather conditions. I'd scan the treetops with binoculars, noting any smoke or signs of distress. Afternoons were spent hiking the nearby trails, stretching my legs, letting the sounds of birds and rustling leaves replace the constant hum of city life I had left behind. Evenings were reserved for reading or sketching by lantern light, the quiet broken only by the occasional call over the radio from other towers. Most nights, the only company I had was the wind whispering through the trees and the distant howl of coyotes echoing through the valley. It was peaceful, reassuring, until tonight. The air felt wrong, heavy. Even the trees, normally alive with movement, stood eerily still. Not a single branch swayed, no leaves rustled. The forest held its breath, waiting. For what? I didn't know. I stepped out onto the balcony, gripping the railing as I scanned the tree line. The sky was darkening, the last hints of sunlight slipping below the hills. Nothing looked out of place, but the sensation wouldn't leave me. A pressure against my chest, like the weight of unseen eyes watching from beyond the trees. The radio crackled behind me, breaking the silence. I turned, stepping back inside, adjusting the dial. Just static. No voices, no check-ins from the other towers. But the feeling remained. Something was different tonight. Something had changed. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt the creeping edge of unease. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, the radio crackled. Not the usual static. This was sharp, frantic. Anyone there? This is Tower 6. Please. Static drowned the rest. My fingers fumbled with the dial, twisting it carefully, pulse quickening. The voice returned, clearer this time, but trembling. The fear was unmistakable. It's here. A shuddering breath. It knows I'm alone. Don't let it know you heard me. Then, silence. The transmission cut off. A cold shiver crawled down my spine. Tower 6. It had been abandoned for years. I sat frozen, gripping the edge of the desk. My mind struggled to catch up. That voice, whoever they were terrified. It wasn't the kind of fear you hear in lost hikers or stranded campers. This was something deeper, primal. The sound of someone realizing they were about to die. I reached for the radio mic, then hesitated. Don't let it know you heard me. What the hell did that mean? I swallowed hard, staring out into the darkening forest. A faint breeze stirred the treetops, but the air around me still felt thick, suffocating. I leaned closer to the radio, listening, waiting. Maybe there would be a follow-up call. Maybe I had imagined it. But the radio remained silent. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of interference. A broadcast picked up from miles away, an old distress signal that somehow looped back through the frequency. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I pressed the button on the radio mic, my voice barely above a whisper. Tower 6, do you copy? Nothing. Static hissed through the speaker, shifting, crackling. Then, just as I was about to release the button, there was something else. A faint noise, buried in the distortion, a rustling sound. Then, breathing, ragged, shallow. I leaned in closer, my own breath catching in my throat. A soft thud echoed through the static, like something heavy shifting on wood. Then, so quiet, I almost didn't hear it. A click. The sound of a radio being turned off. I pulled away, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at me to shut my own radio off, to throw it across the room and pretend I never heard that call. But I couldn't move. I couldn't shake the image forming in my mind. Someone alone in Tower 6, clutching their radio, knowing something was inside with them, knowing they weren't going to make it. I turned off the radio and sat in the dark, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Outside, the forest was still. Too still. A sharp crack echoed through the trees below. I jerked my head up, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't the wind. No gust had passed through the forest. This was different, like wood splitting, something breaking under immense pressure. Stepping onto the balcony, I scanned the darkness below. The trees loomed like sentinels, their trunks vanishing into the thick blackness between them. And then, something moved. A shape, darker than the night itself, shifting between the trees. I couldn't make out a figure, just an absence of light, a thing that distorted the space around it. My breath caught in my throat. It was watching me. Then it moved, not like a person walking, not even like an animal darting through the brush. It shifted, disjointed, as if its limbs weren't bending the right way. It flickered, jerking forward in unnatural motions, then vanishing between the trees. A wave of nausea rolled over me. My hands gripped the railing, knuckles white. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but I was rooted in place, breath shallow, muscles locked in terror. Then came the sound. Knock, knock, knock. I whirled around. The knocks came from below, from the first door at the base of the tower. No one should be there. Knock, knock, knock. Slower, deliberate. The radio crackled inside. I turned back toward the cabin, blood pounding in my ears. The static buzzed, shifting, before a voice, low, distorted, filtered through. Daniel, let me in. My stomach dropped. I hadn't spoken my name over the radio. I killed the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears as I edged toward the window, moving slow, careful not to make a sound. The floorboards creaked beneath me despite my best efforts. The knocking had stopped, but something was still there. I peered into the night. A figure stood at the base of the tower, motionless. Too still. A silhouette, barely outlined against the faint glow of the moon filtering through the treetops. At first, I thought it was a man. But then I noticed the head, tilted too far to the side. Not just tilted, hanging, as if the neck had snapped and barely held the weight of the skull. One shoulder rose higher than the other in a grotesque angle, the body twisted unnaturally. Its arms dangled limp, fingers too long, twitching ever so slightly. My breath hitched. It moved. Not like a person stepping forward, not like an animal creeping closer. It jerked, lurching forward in unnatural motions, limbs bending as if they weren't entirely attached. One moment it stood at the edge of the clearing, the next, closer. It didn't walk. It shuddered toward me in a series of flickering movements, like a glitching frame of reality. I stumbled backward from the window, gripping the edge of the desk so hard my fingers ached. My lungs burned. I had forgotten to breathe. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to be some trick of my tired mind, some hallucination brought on by isolation. But when I looked again, it was closer. Its head jerked upright, its face, I couldn't see it. Only a void where features should be, shifting, distorting like smoke, barely contained in a shape. Then the radio crackled. I flinched as the static hissed through the cabin, the sound sharp against the suffocating silence. A voice, low, wrong. "Daniel, let me in." I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. My name. It had spoken my name. No one should have known I was here. The radio distorted, a sickening gurgle, like something wet trying to form words. The voice crackled again, layered over static, the edges raw and garbled. "Daniel, open the door." "No." I shook my head, gripping the mic with shaking fingers but not daring to respond. The air in the cabin felt heavier, pressing against my chest. My stomach twisted as another realization hit me. The door at the base of the tower was unlocked. I had checked it earlier. I knew I had locked it. But had I? I couldn't remember. A noise outside made my breath freeze in my throat. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, ascending the stairs. The wood creaked beneath its weight. Step, step, step. I backed away from the window, pulse hammering so hard it felt like my ribs might crack under the pressure. The steps were measured, almost thoughtful, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was taking its time. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and clutched it like a weapon. My free hand hovered over the radio mic, unsure if calling for help would make things worse. If I made a sound, would it know? Another step. Closer. The wood groaned under its weight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The room suddenly felt smaller. The air, thicker. A shadow passed across the window. I sucked in a breath, pressing myself against the wall. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, knuckles white. I could hear it breathing now, slow, ragged, wet, like something struggling to inhale through broken lungs. It was at the top of the stairs, just outside the door. I held my breath. The handle twitched. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound rattled through the cabin, shaking the walls. The voice whispered through the radio again, closer now. "Daniel, let me in." And this time, it wasn't asking. The radio erupted with static again, a burst of noise, like a voice struggling to cut through the interference. The words barely formed at first, swallowed by distortion, but then they sharpened. Tower 9, do not respond. It listens through the frequency. I froze. The same voice, the same man from Tower 6. But that wasn't possible. Tower 6 had been abandoned for years. I reached for the mic, my fingers hovering over the button. Then I stopped. A shadow passed across the window. It was still out there. It had climbed the stairs. I slid under the desk, pressing my body against the cold floorboards, willing myself to be nothing, to make no sound. My breath came shallow and slow as I peered through the narrow space between the desk and the window. A shape loomed on the balcony, a nightmare in the dim moonlight. It was pressed against the glass, hands splayed wide, fingers too long and thin, the skin stretched too tight. The face, God. The skin was charred, blackened and flaking, like it had been burned but never healed. Its jaw hung slack, dislocated, drooping at an impossible angle. Lips cracked and broken, barely clinging to the exposed bone beneath. The eyes, white, yellow, empty, but somehow looking. Black liquid oozed from its mouth, dribbling down its chin in thick, slow-moving trails. It shouldn't be able to see me, but it was searching. Its ruined face tilted, pressing closer to the window, the glass fogging under its breath. A long, rattling inhale filled the air, as if it was tasting something. Then, a fingertip dragged down the glass, a slow, deliberate motion, scraping. I clenched my jaw, biting down on my own terror. The urge to scream was so powerful, it felt like my throat was closing. The radio crackled again. Tower 9, do not respond. It listens through the frequency. My stomach churned. The warning was clear, but I was frozen in place. The thing outside knew I was here. It had seen me. It had heard me. The voice on the radio came again, more frantic this time, layered with static and desperation. Made of ash and bone. A whisper now, repeated over and over, fading into static. Ash and bone, ash and bone, ash and bone. I shut my eyes tight, gripping the floor with trembling fingers, waiting for the next move, for the thing to stop looking, for it to try the door, or worse, for it to find another way in. The thing outside Tower 9 was watching me. It had pressed its grotesque face against the glass for what felt like hours, dragging those two long fingers along the window in slow, deliberate strokes. The balcony groaned under its weight as it shifted, stepping away from the glass. My heart pounded in the silence that followed. Then, it spoke. Daniel. My name, in my own voice. I clamped a hand over my mouth, willing myself to make no sound. The voice was too perfect, not garbled, not inhuman. It was me. Daniel, open the door, it's safe now, you can let me in. No, 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 no. My pulse slammed against my ribs. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The voice came again, softer now. Please, I don't know what's happening. I think I'm losing my mind. It was pleading now, full of desperation and confusion, like someone trapped in a nightmare. Like I would sound if I were terrified. That's not me. It's lying. Then came the sound, fingernails scraping against wood, slow, methodical, circling the walls of the cabin. The sound crept from one side of the tower to the next, growing louder, faster, more erratic, scratching, digging, searching. I curled tighter beneath the desk, my knuckles white as I clutched my radio. The static had stopped. The world outside was holding its breath. Then, knock, 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 at the door, gentle, rhythmic. Daniel, let me in. I don't know what to do. The knocks turned violent, the door shuddering in its frame as the thing slammed against it. I flinched, barely biting back a scream. Then, silence. I dared to peek over the desk, my breath locked in my throat. The creature had moved away from the door. It stood just outside the window again, its grotesque face twisted into something almost human. Its mouth curled into an approximation of a smile, the black ooze dripping from its lips, stretching with emotion. "I know you're scared," it whispered, my voice laced with unnatural sweetness. "But I promise, if you let me in, it'll all be okay." I pressed my palms over my ears, willing it to stop. But it wouldn't stop. It kept whispering, kept pleading, kept mocking me with my own words, my own voice. "Daniel, let me in. Daniel, don't leave me out here. Daniel." And then, silence. No more knocking, no more scratching, just the distant rustling of trees in the wind. I lifted my head, my pulse a hammering drumbeat in my ears. The sky outside was lightening. Sunrise. A desperate hope bloomed in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, I could survive until daylight. But the thing outside knew it too, and it wasn't done with me yet. The silence stretched thin. I kept my head down, knees drawn to my chest beneath the desk. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to stay still, to breathe. Maybe it was gone. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the terror had twisted itself into hallucination. Maybe. Then I felt it. A presence. Something watching me. Slowly, carefully, I lifted my head and froze. The creature stood directly outside the window across from me. Its head tilted, farther than a human head should tilt. Its neck bending at a grotesque, unnatural angle, almost resting on its own shoulder. Charred skin peeled away in flakes, exposing blackened bone underneath. The thing had no lips now, only a stretched, open maw, where its jaw dangling uselessly. But it wasn't the mouth that terrified me. It was the eyes. For the first time, they focused. Before, they had been hollow, white and yellow, vacant, as if staring through me rather than at me. But now, they saw me, and the moment it knew that I knew, it laughed, a horrid, guttural sound rattling from its throat, thick with something wet and sludgy. Its whole body shook with the effort, black liquid spewing from its ruined mouth, dripping down the glass in thick, inky streaks. The eyes burned with something primal, something hungry. It slapped a hand against the window, long fingers splayed, leaving behind a greasy smear of something wrong. I ducked my head, squeezing my eyes shut. I could not look at it anymore. The laughter continued, louder now, mocking me. My own fear was fuel to whatever nightmare stood outside. The black sludge gushed from its broken face, spattering against the window in thick globs as it giggled and choked and whispered in its fragmented, distorted voice. "Daniel." I shut it out. I pulled my knees up tighter, clenched my hands over my ears, pressed my forehead to the wooden floor. My own breath came too fast, too loud, and I hated it because I knew. It knew. I was afraid. I waited for the sound of shattering glass, for the door to break, for the moment it would finally come inside and end this game. And then, the radio crackled. I flinched. The creature stopped laughing. Static hummed in the stillness. Then a voice, weak, barely audible. The same voice from Tower 6. Tower 9. A pause. A horrible gasping inhale. "It's almost over." I pressed a trembling hand to my radio, barely breathing. "You're so close," the voice rasped. "Just don't listen to it. Don't see it. Hold on until..." The static cut off. Silence. The creature outside let out a soft, rattling exhale like wind rushing through dead leaves. I did not move. I did not look up. I counted the seconds in my head. Then, a noise. Not from outside, from inside. The door swung open. A wave of cold air swept through the cabin. Footsteps thumped against the wooden floor. Heavy, human. I squeezed my eyes tighter. No, 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 no. Daniel. My stomach lurched. The voice, real, human, familiar. Hey, he's here! Another voice, more footsteps. I looked up. The creature was gone. And in its place, 3 men in ranger uniforms stood in the doorway. I didn't move at first. My brain refused to process what was happening. The tallest ranger, a man in his 50s with a thick graying beard, crouched in front of me, concern etching deep lines into his weathered face. "Son, you all right?" he asked, voice steady but careful. I just stared. The adrenaline still drowned me, my mind stuck in survival mode. Another ranger, younger, stepped forward, scanning the room, his brows knitting together. Jesus Christ, what the hell happened in here? I followed his gaze. The cabin was destroyed. The windows were smeared with black streaks, the walls covered in deep scratches, as if something had clawed its way around the room, desperate to get in. The floor was wet, not water, but something thicker, something dark. The older ranger grabbed my shoulder. "Daniel, we need you to tell us what happened." My mouth was dry. My tongue felt like sandpaper. My voice cracked. "How did you—" "We got an emergency call," the younger ranger said. "About 20 minutes ago, a distress signal was sent out from Tower 9. I stared at him. "But I trailed off, because I hadn't sent out any signal." The rangers exchanged glances. "Well, someone did," the older one muttered. "And judging by the look of this place, it's a damn good thing they did." I tried to stand. One of the rangers helped me to my feet. "Let's get you out of here," he said. "You're coming with us." I didn't argue. I didn't want to be in this tower a second longer. And as I stepped outside, I saw it. The footprints burned into the wood, leading away from the tower. But then they just stopped, and I knew something had heard me. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Click the bell icon so you never miss any new content. Stay tuned for more creepy stories coming soon. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the dark, subscribe for more. Because the best horror isn't what you hear. It's what follows when the story is over.